Have you ever wondered if the history written in old books is actually a lie designed to hide the truth about who we really are? For centuries, the story of the Louisiana Creoles was buried under myths, secrets, and forced silence, but a silent revolution in our blood is finally breaking the code. Before we uncover this hidden truth, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves uncovering hidden history, because together we are building a community that seeks the real story. To understand this massive revelation, we have to travel back in time. We need to stand in the humid, muddy waters of early Louisiana. We need to look past the romantic images of jazz, Mardi Gras, and fancy mansions. The real story of the Creoles is not found in tourist brochures. It is found in the soil, in the family Bibles, and most importantly, in the genetic code passed down through generations. For a very long time, people thought they knew exactly what a Creole was. If you ask someone on the street, they might tell you it means a mix of French and Spanish. They might picture someone with a fancy accent eating beignets. But this common understanding is completely wrong. It is a shallow view that ignores the deep, complex reality of the people who actually built this culture. The truth is much more fascinating. The word Creole did not start as a racial category. It did not start as a description of skin color. In the early days of colonization, the word was used to describe anyone born in the New World. If your parents were from France, but you were born in Louisiana, you were a Creole. If your parents were brought from Africa as enslaved people, but you were born in Louisiana, you were also a Creole. This is a crucial point that changes everything. Being Creole was originally about geography. It was about where you took your first breath. It was a shared experience of surviving in a harsh, unfamiliar, and beautiful land. The early colonists faced terrible diseases, brutal storms, and constant threats. The bond they formed was not about race. It was about survival. They shared a unique identity that was entirely separate from the people back in Europe or Africa. But as time went on, the meaning of the word began to shift. The social dynamics of Louisiana were incredibly complex. The French and Spanish colonizers did not just interact with each other. They interacted with the Native American tribes who had lived on the land for thousands of years. They also brought over thousands of enslaved Africans. In this melting pot, a new kind of society began to form. Unlike the English colonies to the north, the French and Spanish had different rules regarding race and mixing. The Catholic Church played a huge role, and while they certainly upheld the brutal institution of slavery, they also had a different cultural approach to race. There was a recognized class of free people of color. These were individuals who had bought their freedom or been freed by their owners. This free class of people, known as the Creoles of color, became a massive part of the Louisiana story. They were not just a small side note in history. They were wealthy, educated, and highly cultured. They owned property, ran businesses, and even owned enslaved people themselves. They spoke French, attended the opera, and sent their children to schools in Paris. They created a vibrant, distinct society right in the middle of a slave-holding territory. At the same time, there were the white Creoles. These were the descendants of the European settlers. They held the political power in the large plantations. But even among the white Creoles, the bloodlines were not as pure as they claimed. The humid air of Louisiana held many secrets. There were hidden relationships, unrecorded children, and quiet unions that crossed the strict racial lines of the time. Then came the Acadians. Many people confuse Acadians with Creoles, but they are entirely different. The Acadians were French settlers from Canada who were forced out by the British. They settled in the rural swamps and prairies of Louisiana. They became known as Cajuns. They were poor, rural, and isolated. The Creoles, on the other hand, were largely urban, wealthy, and connected to the global economy. The two groups lived side by side, but rarely mixed in the early days. The real turning point for the Creole population happened in the early 1800s. A massive event across the Caribbean changed the demographics of Louisiana forever. The Haitian Revolution, a massive and successful slave rebellion, sent shockwaves through the colonial world. Fleeing the violence, thousands of people left the French colony of Saint-Domingue. They packed up their lives, their wealth, and their enslaved workers, and they sailed to New Orleans. This influx of refugees literally doubled the population of New Orleans. And it was not just white planters who arrived. A huge portion of these refugees were free people of color and enslaved Africans. This migration brought a massive wave of French-speaking, Catholic, culturally rich people of African descent. It supercharged the Creole of color community. It brought new traditions, new foods, new music, and a deeper connection to African roots. This is the golden age of the Creole culture. New Orleans became a city unlike any other in North America. It was a place where the air was thick with the smell of spices, the sound of French conversations, and the rhythm of African drums. It was a place where the lines between Europe, Africa, and the Americas blurred into something entirely new. The Creoles were the architects of this unique world. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of the Creoles, please drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss our weekly journeys into the forgotten past, because your support keeps these vital stories alive. But this golden age was about to face a massive threat. In 1803, the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France. This was the Louisiana Purchase. Suddenly, the complex, fluid, and colorful society of Louisiana was absorbed into the young, expanding, and highly racialized United States. The Americans brought with them a completely different way of looking at the world. The Anglo-Americans did not understand the Creole system. In the American mindset, race was a strict binary. You were either white or you were black. There was no middle ground. There was no accepted class of wealthy, educated, free people of color. The Americans looked at the Creoles of color and saw only their African ancestry. They ignored their wealth, their education, and their culture. This cultural clash was intense. The Americans and the Creoles literally divided the city of New Orleans. The Creoles stayed upriver in the French Quarter and the Faubourg. The Americans settled downriver in what is now the Central Business District. They even built a canal, which is now Canal Street, to physically separate the two cultures. The divide was not just physical. It was a war over identity. As the decades passed, the American way of thinking began to win. The political power shifted. The English language began to replace French in schools and government. The strict racial laws of the American South began to creep into Louisiana. The fluid identity of the Creoles was slowly being squeezed out of existence. The paper records, the census takers, and the law enforcement began to force people into rigid boxes. If you had any African ancestry, no matter how small, the American system wanted to classify you as black. This was the beginning of the end for the distinct Creole identity. The Creoles of color fought back. They used their wealth, their education, and their legal knowledge to challenge these new laws. They fought in the courts. They wrote in the newspapers. They tried to protect their unique status. One of the most famous examples of this fight was the case of Homer Plessy. Plessy was a Creole of color. He looked white, but he had African ancestry. He deliberately sat in the white-only car of a train to challenge the new segregation laws. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The result was the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which established the separate but equal doctrine. The loss of this case was a devastating blow to the Creoles of color. It legally cemented the racial divide. It meant that the complex, mixed heritage of the Creoles was no longer recognized by the state. You were either white or you were colored. The rich, nuanced history of the Creole people was being erased by the stroke of a pen. The paper trail was being rewritten to fit the American narrative. Then came the Jim Crow era. This was a time of extreme racial tension and violence in the South. The Ku Klux Klan rose to power. Lynchings became terrifyingly common. In this environment, claiming a mixed Creole identity became dangerous. Many families chose to hide their heritage. They crossed the color line. They passed as white to protect their children from the brutal reality of segregation. When families passed as white, they had to cut ties with their darker-skinned relatives. They had to change their names. They had to burn old letters and destroy family Bibles that recorded the truth of their ancestry. They carried the heavy burden of a stolen identity. They lived in constant fear of being discovered. The secrets of their bloodline were locked away in silence. For generations, this silence held. The true history of the Louisiana Creoles was buried under the heavy weight of American racial politics. The descendants of the white Creoles often believed they were purely European. The descendants of the Creoles of color often had fragmented, lost connections to their specific African or Native American roots. The paper trail was broken. The official records were full of lies, omissions, and forced categorizations. But you cannot hide from biology. You cannot erase what is written in the cells of your body. While the paper records were being altered and destroyed, the DNA was quietly keeping the true score. It was waiting. It was preserving the history that the society tried to erase. And then, at the turn of the 21st century, the science of genetics finally caught up to the mystery. We are about to reveal the shocking DNA results that changed everything. So if you want to be part of a community that values truth over comfortable myths, hit that notification bell. Share this video with your family group chat, and let us know in the comments what you think your DNA would reveal. When commercial DNA testing first became available to the public, people had certain expectations. Those who identified as white Creoles expected to see mostly French and Spanish markers. Those who identified as Creoles of color expected to see mostly West African markers. They expected the DNA to confirm the stories their grandparents had told them. They expected the science to match the paper records. They were in for a massive shock. The DNA results did not just tweak the family trees. They completely shattered them. For many white Creole families, the test revealed a significant amount of West African DNA. The myths of pure European bloodlines were instantly broken. The secrets of the past were dragged into the light. It turned out that the early colonial days were much more integrated than the later generations wanted to admit. But the surprises did not stop there. Many of these same white Creole families also discovered unexpected Native American DNA. This was a huge revelation. For a long time, the official history downplayed the mixing between European settlers and Native Americans. The paper records rarely mentioned it, but the DNA does not lie. It showed that the early survival of the colony relied heavily on the knowledge, help, and intermarriage with the local native tribes. On the other side of the color line, the Creoles of color were also getting shocking results. Many of them took DNA tests, hoping to find their exact roots in Africa. They wanted to connect with the specific tribes their ancestors were taken from. While they did find West African markers, the results were often much more complex than expected. Many found significant amounts of European DNA, specifically from France and Spain. This European DNA was not just a random surprise, it was the genetic footprint of the colonial era. It was the physical proof of the complex, often non-consensual, relationships between white planters and enslaved women. It was the biological reality of a system built on exploitation. For many descendants, seeing this European DNA was a painful reminder of the trauma their ancestors endured. It was a silent witness to a dark history. But the DNA also revealed something incredibly beautiful. It showed the deep, enduring connections that were formed in the crucible of Louisiana. It showed that despite the brutal system of slavery, despite the strict laws of Jim Crow, people still found ways to connect. The DNA proved that the Creole identity was not just a social construct. It was a biological reality. It was a true blending of the world. The genetic scientists studying these results were fascinated. They found specific haplogroups that told a detailed story of migration. They could trace the African DNA back to specific regions like Senegambia and the Bight of Benin. This perfectly matched the historical records of the transatlantic slave trade. They could trace the European DNA back to specific provinces in France and specific regions in Spain. The DNA was acting as a historical document that could not be forged. Perhaps the most emotional discoveries were related to the Native American DNA. For many families who had been classified as strictly black or strictly white for generations, finding Native American markers was a profound experience. It connected them to the original inhabitants of the land. It validated the oral histories that had been passed down in whispers. It proved that the old stories about Native American grandmothers were not just myths, they were true. Let us talk about how this DNA testing actually works, because understanding the science makes the emotional impact even stronger. When you spit into a tube and send it to a lab, the scientists are not looking at your whole genome. They are looking at specific markers. They are looking at tiny changes in your DNA that happen over thousands of years. These markers act like a genetic clock. They tell the scientists exactly where your ancestors lived and when they migrated. For the Creole descendants, this science was like finding a lost language. Many of them had never known the true names of their ancestors. They had never known the villages in Africa where their family originated. The DNA test gave them those names. It gave them those villages. It allowed them to cross an ocean of time and space and finally touch the hands of their ancestors. It was a profound spiritual experience for many, and then there were the family reunions. The DNA matching tools allowed people to find cousins they never knew existed. Because of the history of passing as white and hiding their heritage, many Creole families were split apart. Brothers and sisters lost touch. Cousins grew up not knowing each other. The DNA tests bridged these gaps. Darker-skinned descendants and lighter-skinned descendants were suddenly connecting on social media. They were sharing old photos. They were comparing family stories. They were healing generational wounds. These DNA revelations have caused a massive shift in how people understand their identity. For some, it has been a source of deep pain. Discovering that your family history includes slavery, or that your ancestors passed as white and abandoned their darker relatives, is a heavy burden to carry. It forces families to have difficult, uncomfortable conversations. It requires them to look at the ugly parts of their history and accept them. But for many others, the DNA results have been incredibly liberating. It has freed them from the rigid boxes that society forced them into. It has allowed them to embrace the full, complex reality of who they are. They no longer have to choose between being black, white, or Native American. They can simply be Creole. They can be the living embodiment of the complex history of Louisiana. The DNA has also sparked a massive cultural revival. Descendants who had lost touch with their Creole roots are now reconnecting. They are learning the French language. They are cooking the traditional foods. They are playing the old music. They are finding each other through social media and DNA matching. The silent revolution in their blood has led to a loud, proud reclamation of their culture. This cultural revival is not just about feeling good. It is about correcting the historical record. For over a century, the history of Louisiana was told from the perspective of the Anglo-Americans. The Creoles were either ignored, marginalized, or misunderstood. Their contributions to the state and the country were downplayed. But now, with the DNA evidence and a renewed sense of pride, the Creoles are taking back their narrative. They are writing their own books. They are making their own documentaries. They are teaching their own history. And we see this revival in the most everyday aspects of life. Take the food, for example. Creole cuisine is often misunderstood as just spicy food, but it is actually a highly sophisticated blend of French cooking techniques, African ingredients, Spanish spices, and Native American knowledge. When a modern Creole chef cooks a pot of gumbo, they are not just making a meal. They are recreating a historical document. Every ingredient in that pot tells a story of migration, survival, and mixing. The food is the DNA on a plate. This brings us to the ultimate truth about the Louisiana Creoles. They were never just a simple mix of French and Spanish. They were never just a racial category created by the American South. They were, and always have been, a unique, resilient, and deeply connected people. They are the living proof that human beings cannot be easily categorized. They are the proof that our history is much more intertwined than we want to admit. The story of the Creoles is a story of survival. It is a story of how people adapted to a harsh new world. It is a story of how culture is created in the spaces between different groups of people. It is a story of how the truth, no matter how hard you try to hide it, will always find a way to reveal itself. Today, the Creole identity is stronger than it has been in a century. The attempts to erase it through Jim Crow laws and forced assimilation have failed. The paper records may have been altered, but the blood remembers. The DNA has finally given the Creoles the ultimate proof of their history. It has validated their existence. It has given them the tools to tell their true story to the world. As we look at the modern map of Louisiana, we see the legacy of this incredible journey. We see it in the architecture of New Orleans. We hear it in the music that echoes through the streets. We taste it in the rich, complex flavors of Creole cuisine. But most importantly, we see it in the people. The descendants of the Creoles are walking proof that our differences are what make us strong. This brings us to a deeper philosophical question. If our DNA shows that we are all mixed, what does that mean for the concept of race? The story of the Louisiana Creoles forces us to confront this question head-on. The rigid racial lines drawn in the 19th and 20th centuries were entirely artificial. They were created to maintain power and control. They were designed to divide people who would otherwise be united. The DNA proves that these lines are a fiction. When you look at the genetic makeup of a true Creole family, you see the entire history of the world. You see the ancient migrations out of Africa. You see the settlement of Europe. You see the crossing of the Atlantic. You see the survival in the American swamps. You see the triumph over slavery and segregation. The Creole bloodline is a microcosm of human history. It is a beautiful, complex, and unbreakable chain of survival. The revelation of the DNA is not just about the past. It is a lesson for the future. It teaches us that race is a social construct, but our shared humanity is a biological fact. It teaches us that we are all connected by threads of history that go back much further than we realize. The Louisiana Creoles were never what we thought they were. They were always so much more. So the next time you hear the word Creole, do not just think of a simple mix of European cultures. Think of the deep, complex, and beautiful reality of the people who bore that name. Think of the survival, the resilience, and the truth that was written in their blood. The silent revolution has happened. The truth is finally out, and it is more powerful than anyone could have ever imagined.